Today, we're at the Spitfire and Hurricane Memorial Museum. It's a wonderful little free museum. Donations are welcome though. Just outside of Margate by Manston Air Force Base, now Manston Airport. And it's right next door to the Manston Air Force Base Museum over there. But the Spitfire and Hurricane one is free. And it is a beautiful little museum. Very easy to cast an eye and think, oh, they have two aircraft, that's it. But it's actually a fascinating slice of aviation history. You can see from the car park, over there where those cars are, behind that is the airport of today. And you can see the brick control tower up there from the Cold War era and when Manston was a international airport. But here, today we're just going to go around the Spitfire and Hurricane Memorial Museum. And before we head in, it's good to have a little walk around the outside, as actually it's quite easy to overlook some of the details on the outside. You can see there a searchlight, which is an original Second World War searchlight. The lamp itself is missing, but it gives you a good idea of the searchlights that were used against bombers coming into Britain. And it's lovely to see an original searchlight. You see them in movies, but you often don't actually see the real thing. You can get pretty up close and personal with it and see exactly how the lenses on the front work. It's a manually tilted. It is a memorial to pilots who flew from here, as there was a long history of flight, both pre-war, during the war, and during the Cold War there was an American Air Force base, and then there was an airport. And here, this is a Second World War bomb raid shelter, but it's a shelter for someone like a fire warden in the ARP, and they could easily be lifted by the circle on the top. They could just bolt themselves inside and it would protect them against falling masonry and such. There's a series of interesting memorials around the side. There's a memorial here to the United States Air Force were based here, particularly during the Cold War, but also during the Second World War. And here there's, I believe that's a mine, although it's a little bit hard to tell from the lack of the probes on the side. Here is the Royal Air Force Manston motto and badge on the side of the memorial building. And there's a series of memorials here to the brave pilots of the Channel Dash, which took off from here. We'll cover that in more detail when we go inside. And a series of memorials for people who served at RAF Manston over the years. And quite easy to overlook these round the side. The first time I came here, I just went to the museum and actually missed these little details at the side. And you can see the Second World War propeller blade there. This particular memorial is for all of those who served at RAF Manston. And to the side of it, there's a memorial to the 18 Fleet Air Arm crew who flew from RAF Manston, as this was actually a Fleet Air Arm base at times, and took part in the Channel Dash. On the 22nd of March 1941, the Germans decided to run the Scharnhorst, the Genissau, and the heavy cruiser, the Prinz-Eugen, through the English Channel. And the British were determined to sink them. So there was a heavy fight, and the British sent the rather outdated Fairy Swordfish, which, if you've seen our video on the Fleet Air Arm Museum a couple of weeks ago, you'll see it was really a little bit dated for 1941, and all 18 crew died. So whilst it didn't sink any of those ships, it was part of the continued operation to ensure that Germany wasn't able to make use of them during the Second World War. Now inside, you've got 2 rooms in this museum, and here's the room on the left. We'll start with a Hurricane. We'll work our way round the Hurricane, and then we'll work our way around the walls. You can see a beautiful original Hurricane displayed with a wide range of very accurate period items. You have the flight jacket and headgear of the original pilot's costume. Here is a gun from BF 110. There's actually 2 of them. The one on the right with the double barrels is the machine gun that was fired from the rear gunner. And then you have the cannon here, which is a bit like the Hispania Suiza that we'll see shortly, which was fired from the front. Here's a cockpit piece of a Spitfire Mark 1A, quite a bit earlier than the Spitfire we're going to see in a minute, but you get an opportunity to look inside and you can see the simplicity of the controls. You have the foot pedals for the rudders. You can see this tilting throttle there, and there's various wheel controls. Compared to today's airplanes, a very limited number of dials. And if you look carefully, you can see an azimuth in the middle where you could see the stability of it. Here's a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Pretty much every British plane during the Second World War, slight exaggeration, but it's very common. Spitfire, Hurricane, Lancaster, everywhere you look there's a Merlin, even a P-51D Mustang. So really lovely to see one close up. There's an example here of the central propeller blade and how it works up through. Series of jerry cans and oil cans. Ones in the backgrounds are jerry cans. It was actually a German design. Possibly that's where the name Jerry comes from. Couldn't possibly say. But we stole the design because it was very functional. And after that, they were called jerry cans. Series of paintings. You get very close to the back of this. You have to remember that the Hawker Hurricane was a wood and metal framed aircraft. So a lot of the skin is actually fabric, and you can get close enough to touch, but are encouraged not to do so. Here there's a cockpit of a Lancaster, and they actually sell, you can do a flight in it, so you can fly with a flight simulator screen in front of you, and a crew member sits next to you and advises you in terms of flying and control and really guides you through it. Really excellent little experience there. Here you can see one of the cannons from the Hurricane. And if you look in the middle of the wing behind it, you can see a little bump. And that bump is for the gun mechanism because the gun was taller than the wing. And you see that even more so with the Spitfire because the Spitfire's wings were particularly elegant and slim. And although it's a later Spitfire that we'll see, you still have quite a marked bump where the cannon was put in place. Here you can see this is a Belgian example, this particular one. But from the Second World War, I believe it's Belgian officers serving in the RAF, as there were foreign squadrons within the RAF. There's a whole history and explanation. There's a Second World War motorbike there. And this here is a camera. So that's for when you're flying over and you want to get pictures for bomb damage assessment or for planning, and very interesting to see an original one. There's a cutaway of the Kestrel. Kestrel was a kind of precursor of the Merlin that was used in all of these, and it was a very small but supercharged engine that was used in some pre-war planes. Now, working our way around the wall, you can see the Supermarine S6B there, which if you watched our video on the Science Museum, the second video, the room with the Hall of Flight actually has the original S9B, which won the Schneider Trophy, which was the most prestigious trophy for air racing in the 1930s. And it was from that the Spitfire emerged. Maybe that should be in the other hall, but... And around here, there's a very good series of explanations of history, and it walks through the 1930s, the road to war, Chamberlain with his Peace in Our Time, series of models of different aircraft from the time as a Hawker Fury and Messerschmitt Bf 109, but a pre-war one of the it's not a fighter, it's a training plane, through to the launch of the attack, and some very good models of Polish at the top there, a Dutch Fokker on the right, down to a series of lovely French planes here, particularly like the WWII here on the right, which is kind of like French Spitfire. Down below, there's a series of British planes from the early war years. Beaufighter, Ferry Battle there, which hopefully you recognise from the Fleet Air Arm Museum. The Blenheim and the Beaufighter should recognise from RAF Hendon video if you've watched it. And then over to German planes, the Junkers and Messerschmitts, Fiat Falco, the Italian bomber, up above the HE-111 and the Junkers Stuka. Oh, series of very good, beautifully made, well displayed models of significant aircraft from that period. And that kind of continues throughout the museum. And I do like how they have consistent scale and actually call out what the scale is. If you're not a model maker, it's maybe not a big deal. But quite often you'll see a series of planes together and you think, well, that's really nice, but they are not the same scale and they misrepresent how the plane actually looks. But here's a series of uniforms. Here's a Battle of Britain era German Luftwaffe costume. There's a whole series of guns. Pictures of motor launchers from during the Battle of Britain. Different uniforms. Guns, equipment, memorabilia. Fragments of crashed aircraft. And really a fascinating collection of Second World War aviation, particularly from around this area where a lot of these items have been found. But some very interesting pieces and some beautiful examples of, for example, the costumes or just wrecked fragment of aircraft. It's quite an interesting museum with a lot of good items and decent explanation of the historical point they're making. Anyone interested in Second World War aviation history will enjoy this museum. Well worth a visit. And surprisingly free. It's difficult to describe. You normally have more aircraft in an aircraft museum. I'd describe it a bit like where you have the steam railways and there are enthusiasts who maintain that. The vibe I got was enthusiasts who love their history, love their aircraft, and are keen to maintain this record of particularly the Second World War. And really they do that around the Spitfire and the Hurricane. But there's also quite a bit about here like the bouncing bomb. So in order to blow up a dam, the Lancasters couldn't just drop a big bomb because it wouldn't create the shock waves in the right way. And the shock waves had to hit the dam at the right point, that they didn't blow up in the water, but they actually blew into the concrete and used the force of the water behind the explosion to help punch through. And this is actually not a Grand Slam bomb, because you'll see the real one if you watch our Hendon Air Force Museum guide. This is one of the test bombs, because it had to sit underneath, be spun, and when it was rotating it was dropped, and it skipped like you're skipping a stone across a lake until it hit with a more limited momentum and rolled back down the face of the dam before exploding under the water. And here are a series of fascinating guns and even cups and saucers from the Luftwaffe mess, various medals, and really interesting items here. We'll make our way through to the second room. It's quite a small museum, don't want to take too long. Guide. And then the other room is a Spitfire. Now, if you're a aircraft enthusiast, you might spot straight away this is quite a late Spitfire. This is Battle Britain era. And you could tell from here, standing here, there's 4 blades, not 3. The cannons sticking out the front of the wing, they were from later on. And if you look at the wing tips, if my camera was down a little bit, the wing tips are clipped. Originally they were elliptical, then from about the Mark IV onwards they were curved, and then they were clipped from about the 9 onwards. So straight away, without looking at the innards there, you can tell that this is a late war Spitfire. Now also a little bit by the shape behind the canopy, but just from those key points, I mean, probably would be good video at some point to do a bit of a walk through the way it evolved, because you often see Battle of Britain Spitfires, but the plane you're seeing wasn't even from the war. And perfect example be if you watch the film The Battle of Britain, those are real Spitfires, but they're Spitfires that I believe were in the service of, well, the German planes were in the service of the Spanish under Franco, but I believe the Spitfires were not British RAF, and they certainly were not from during the war. The shape of the wings was wrong. And here, if you look at that wing, you can see how, because they have the spoilers at the back that lower for at landing, you can see how the wing is so slim that the push rod that actuates the dropping of that flap can't fit within the wing. So it straightens, but when they push down, it has to pop up out of the top. So you have that little pop-up hatch, which again, I've raised the camera and I'm not showing here, but I'm sure we'll get it on in a second. There. In the middle of the wing, you can see a little door on it sticking out. And if you look at the front of the wings, you'll see red tape on those 2 patches. That's actually authentic, and that is correct for the era. The cannons, to avoid dirt getting in them, were the internal guns were covered with red tape, and when fired, that cut through the tape. So it was like a temporary seal. And I talked about how it's a later Spitfire. You can also tell by the air intakes there, but it has the scoop underneath the engine, which came with the much later turbocharged models. And you see the two radiators underneath. The early models had a single one on the right, whereas this has two on either side, plus the scoop for the engine underneath there. So definitely a later, and I believe it's a 14. Really beautiful example, and lovely to see a Spitfire so close up. And a genuine Spitfire, because you see a lot of gate guardians outside RAF bases. Not necessarily a genuine Spitfire. The RAF Hendon has a Hurricane and a Spitfire. Not completely convinced they're original plane. I may be wrong. But sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Whereas here, these are real, genuine Spitfire and Hurricane that have been beautifully and lovingly maintained. And as you can see, you really can get up close enough to touch, even though you are encouraged not to do so. And I didn't. They are not at an arm's length or a distance like many. And here's actually some fragments of that is the interior wing structure. Series of uniforms and flight costumes, some beautiful models of everything from fairy former there through to different types of Spitfire. Good explanation of the three types of Spitfire wingtips here, which you can instantly recognize when it comes from by looking at that wingtip. You see that has the cropped wingtip, whereas the earlier ones didn't. Whole series of lovely models, certificates, paintings, notings. I mean, I recognise, I think that's R.J. Mitchell there on my left, who designed the Spitfire. Picture of the S9B up on the wall. And really a lovely gallery. And I think excellent museum with a really quality collection, well worth a visit if you're down this way. And sadly not very well known. I found this museum completely by accident. So I would definitely recommend a visit. And please do check out our other videos, like and subscribe, and come back next week because we'll be visiting another museum very nearby, which has an excellent collection of quite eclectic planes from particularly the Cold War era, but some very unusual planes and pieces. And easy to combine with this museum, as it is just the other side of the car park. So please do like and subscribe. Come back next week for more museum tours on Mondays and histories on Saturdays.